A sheep just oozes out a stink that drives cowmen plumb to drink. Its hooves leave flavors on the grass that even make the old cows pass. Sheep ranges, cattle sure won't graze, but cowboys hate sheep anyways. Welcome to the Rediscover the Winds podcast, a podcast by the Fremont County Museums. With museums in DuBois, Riverton, and Lander, the Fremont County Museum System is committed to collecting, preserving, and interpreting the stories of Fremont County and the Wind River area. The unique artifacts found at our museums relate the history of central Wyoming with information which, in many cases, can't be found anywhere else. With the Rediscover the Winds podcast, we hope to bring some of that history to you, wherever you are listening. Last episode, we looked at Butch Cassidy and his time in Fremont County. Cassidy was not just a bank robber, but like many outlaws in the West, earned a living by rustling cattle. This episode will look at another key part of Wyoming's history, the sheep and cattle wars. In particular, we will be looking at the disputes and violence between the two groups, the shepherds and the cattlemen. Potentially the first cattle in Wyoming were brought by a fur trade party to the 1830 Wind River Rendezvous that you may recall in episode 1 of our podcast. The first known Wyoming stock raiser was Jack Robinson, a Virginian who settled near Fort Bridger in 1834. Both the cattle and sheep industries grew very slowly for the next several decades. Even 40 years later, in 1870, there were only 46 stock raisers and 23rd stock herders in the territory, and only 6,400 sheep were counted. In 1876, we get one of the first mentions of sheep in the Fremont County area. John D. Woodruff drove 6,000 sheep into the area near Lander, where he negotiated an agreement with Chief Washakie and the Shoshones which would allow him to graze his flocks on the Wind River Reservation. 10,000 more sheep came to Fremont County in 1880 and 1881 from Idaho, these managed by the Haven brothers, whose cabin was located at Sweetwater Bridge between Lander and Rawlins. Several years later, the sheep queen, Lucy Morrison, began accumulating her own stock. However, sheep in central Wyoming weren't too common during this period. Most of the early shepherds stayed closer to the Union Pacific Railroad, as it provided them a means of shipping wool. In the following years, as more railroads were built in central Wyoming, flockmasters expanded into other regions of the territory. While the growth of sheep and cattle industries in Wyoming during the mid-1800s were rather slow, in other parts of the country they expanded rapidly. The cattle industry initially grew to help feed the Confederate Army during the Civil War and continued to expand following the war, as back east, industrial centers had depleted beef supplies that they had also exhausted while feeding the Union Army. By the end of the war, Texas Longhorns were worth $5 out in the open range, but could be sold for $50 in Chicago. The sheep industry also grew as wool was needed for uniforms. The Union Army consumed over 60 pounds of wool per soldier annually. Unlike the cattle industry, however, the value of sheep and wool dropped following the end of the war. Sheepmen who were previously further east on the ranges than the cattlemen soon expanded further west where there was cheaper and more available grazing land. However, this more available grazing land west, while it was public land owned by the federal government, was unofficially claimed as territory by the cattlemen of the West. By 1880, in Wyoming, the number of both sheep had increased to 140,000, over 20 times more than its figure just 10 years prior. The number of cattle had increased to 273,000, and the census listed 311 stock raisers and 669 cattle herders. Substantial increases as well from the previous decade. In 1890, the number had surpassed the number of cattle in the new state of Wyoming, with 673,000 head of cattle to 712,000 sheep. In 1900, the number of cattle remained constant while the number of sheep continued to grow at an exponential rate, this time totaling at 5.1 million. The rapid growth of sheep quickly overtook the number of cattle in the state, and to the cattlemen was perceived as a threat and an encroachment of their territory both on a local level and for the cattlemen who viewed Wyoming as cattle country. In May 1871, before the Second Wyoming Territorial Assembly, Governor Campbell of the Wyoming Territory helped create the Wyoming Stock and Wool Growers Association and became its president. When the Legislative Assembly met in November 1871, Campbell called a simultaneous meeting of the stock growers and held a joint session in the House of Representatives. Though this governor's cattle organization disbanded soon after its founding, in 1873 the Laramie County Stock Growers Association was formed, including both cattle and sheep owners, many of whom had been in the governor's Stock and Wool Growers Association. This Laramie County Stock Growers Association was formed to, quote, advance the interests of stock growers and dealers in livestock of all kinds within the territory. In 1879, the Laramie County Stock Growers Association renamed to the Wyoming Stock Growers Association and expanded its activities to managing roundups, conducting brand inspections, freight rates, fencing issues, and dealing with health and sanitation. The association invited other county stock associations to form one territory-wide organization, and for many years, the Wyoming Stock Growers Association was a leading authority in the territory, not just for cattle, but for all laws. They were even referred to as the de facto territorial government. In 1882, they convinced the governor to appoint a state veterinarian and institute stock laws which prevented the introduction of additional diseases onto Wyoming's ranges. In 1894, the wool growers in the Uinta and Sweetwater counties formed associations to deal with the resolutions passed by local cattlemen in the region. However, the statewide Wyoming Wool Growers Association was not formed until early 1905, when it was created largely to rid the state's sheep of scab. To the cattlemen, they were always there in the state first. They had formed their local and state organizations before the flock masters. Domesticated cattle existed in the region before domesticated sheep, and for the first half-century, there were more cattle than sheep in the territory. So when the hordes of sheep were brought into Wyoming during the second half of the 19th century, they argued that the sheepherders were intruding on their land. A common myth of the time, referred in the poem at the beginning of the podcast, was that once a sheep had grazed in an area, cattle would never graze there again, even long after the sheep had left. Cattlemen believed the sheep despoiled the grass permanently, and therefore, with the expansion of sheep into the territory, they believed that the areas they could graze were rapidly diminishing. They also argued that, despite the fact that they were grazing on public lands, it was their territory as they had been there first. To the flock masters, they believed that they had just as much right as the cattlemen. Sure, the cattlemen had been there first, but the lands were public, and their claims of how sheep despoiled the grass they knew to be false. Legally, the flock masters had done nothing wrong. However, the cattlemen would not let the sheep continue to encroach on their territory. Initially, they warned the flock masters to stay off their land. These warnings were frequently ignored. Then came the deadlines, where territorial lines were drawn up by the cattlemen, and again warned the flock masters to not cross these lines. These warnings were again ignored. Finally came the first altercations. The first reported conflict in Wyoming came in 1878 when a raid was staged on the sheep camp of W.P. Noble. In the following 3 decades, there would be an additional 24 raids and attacks in Wyoming by cattlemen against sheepherders, though the term sheep and cattle wars is somewhat overdramatic considering there's only less than 1 raid a year, and the war was rather one-sided with the cattlemen remaining the primary aggressors. The sheep and cattle war history remains a key part of Wyoming. In Natrona County, just east of Fremont County, cowboys were known to stand off from a band of sheep and use their rifles to pick off as many as they could until they had fired all their shots. Then they would ride away, giving them great amusement and satisfaction at the losses they caused to the sheep owner. If the sheep herder attempted to fight back, he would too be shot at. Another source of amusement for many of the cattlemen was to gather 100 or so heads of steer and drove them through a flock of sheep, killing many and scattering the rest. They also frequently drove sheep off of cliffs, causing great loss to the sheepmen. However, very rarely were these cowboys who murdered, raided, and pillaged brought to trial, even if it was common knowledge who the perpetrators were. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association was arguably the most powerful organization in the territory, so the sheepherders believed a trial in the courts would not only fail to convict the cattlemen, but it would only then cause additional trouble. In 1897, Cattlemen from the area in Du Bois established a deadline, which they wrote in the Lander Clipper newspaper, reading, quote, "The stockmen and settlers of Upper Wind River take this method of requesting all sheep owners not to range any sheep on that section of the country included between the west line of the Shoshone Reservation and the Continental Divide. There are many small stock owners making a living who would be forced to leave the county and abandon their homes in case this locality becomes a sheep range." For the most part, sheepherders frequently adhered to the deadlines established by cattlemen, and it wouldn't be for 5 years before the first violence occurred in Fremont County when, in 1902, several thousand sheep were slaughtered and the herders were killed near Thermopolis, which was, at that time, part of Fremont County. Following the killing, sheepmen from the Rock Springs area wrote a letter to the governor of Wyoming that mentions how, quote, "Trouble between the cattle and sheepmen in Fremont County, which has resulted in the killing of one man and a great loss of personal property, there being some 5,000 head of sheep destroyed, besides outfits and commissary supplies." The violence in Fremont County was relevant for the sheepherders of Rock Springs, not only because they would bring their sheep into the Wind River Range for summer feed and therefore were affected by the trouble, but also because a lack of action taken against the cattlemen in Fremont County would only encourage cattlemen elsewhere to resort to violence. In an effort to hopefully end the violence that was based on territorial claims, the government created the Forest Service, which strictly regulated grazing, primarily in the mountains and foothills, the traditional summer ranges of most sheep ranchers. However, the violence continued. Later that same year, in 1905, 10 masked men attacked a sheep camp on Shell Creek in the Bighorn Basin, where they clubbed 4,000 sheep, burned the sheep wagons, and killed 2 sheepdogs. The owner of the flock, Louis A. Gantz, lost $40,000. In 1906, another raid by cattlemen in Sweetwater County killed a herder and injured 2 more. 24 raiders, all masked and mounted and heavily armed, clubbed the sheep to death and burned the camps down. The flocks were owned by men from Utah, and the raiders were from Burnt Fork, who had repeatedly warned the sheepmen to leave the country. In March 1907, another warning was published in the Lander Clipper towards the sheepmen of Fremont County. The sheepmen of J. A. Delfelder were served a notice to vacate the ranges on the west side of Dry Creek, the notice being signed, quote, "by order of the Cattlemen's Committee." The paper continues, quote, "This establishes Dry Creek as a deadline. Mr. Delfelder is ignoring the notice. Delfelder is a member of the Wyoming State Sheep Commission and has 4 bands of sheep aggregating 12,000 heads on the Dry Creek Range. The Duncan sheep herds are also grazing on the same ranges." While the creation of the Forest Service didn't put an end to the violence, further attempts were made. A committee was held in September 1907 between prominent sheepmen and cattlemen to try to put an end to the violence. Chief of Grazing A. E. Potter of the Forest Service, 3 prominent sheepmen from the Sweetwater Range Association, John W. Hay, Walter B. Dunton, and Lon Poston. There, they discussed changing and establishing grazing boundaries for sheep and cattle. The sheepmen did not ask for anything the cattlemen did not want to give up, nor did they ask for territory that the cattlemen could use. Neither party tried to pull the wool over each other's eyes, as negotiations remained cordial. When the cattlemen offered a strip of land northwest of Twin Buttes, the sheepmen suggested that the cattlemen visit the territory in question, and if they could use it, then they could keep it. Otherwise, the sheepmen would take it off their hands. All in all, negotiations did remain cordial throughout, and it seemed evident that the disputes between the 2 parties were not because of the leadership. Instead, it seemed that violence was created on the local level by frustrated individual cattlemen. This hypothesis was quickly proven correct, because in spite of the efforts made by the cattlemen and sheepmen representatives, the violence did continue. Several months later, a gang of masked men raided the Macoma Sheep Company's camp near Crowheart Butte, where they shot 700 sheep. The Wyoming Wool Growers Association offered a reward of $1,000 for them. In January 1909, the Fremont County Wool Growers Association wrote a letter to the governor of Wyoming asking him and the legislative bodies of Wyoming to enact, quote, "sufficient legislation and possible adequate penalties for crimes of this character, and that the governor of Wyoming recommend the passage of such legislation in his annual message." The most infamous case from the sheep and cattle wars came on the night of April 2nd, 1909. Between 7 and 15 masked men entered the sheep camp and, in cold blood, murdered J. Allemand and Joe Emge, two wealthy and prominent sheepmen, and Joe Lazier, a sheepherder, under their employment. They were camped at the mouth of Spring Creek, 50 miles southwest of Basin, where they were guarding 2,600 sheep. The raiders came upon the wagon and fired a volley into it, resulting in the death of Emge and Lazier. Allemand was woken up by the sound of the raiders and attempted to flee, but was cut down 20 feet from the wagon. Then the wagon was soaked in oil and lit on fire, and the bodies were cremated. 30 sheep were slain, as were 2 sheepdogs. Allemand was an old-time sheepman, and Emge was formerly a cattleman who had recently entered the sheep business. The Bighorn Sheep Growers and State Wool Growers Associations each offered a $1,000 reward for the capture of the raiders. The Wyoming Wool Growers Association wrote a letter to the governor of Wyoming again, this time requesting that he take action against the cattlemen. For the first time in the state's history, sheep raiders had been prosecuted in a Wyoming court. 7 men were arrested and 5 sent to prison. This conviction signified to the cattlemen that no longer could they raid sheepmen without repercussion. The Wind River Mountaineer wrote that, quote, "The conviction of Herbert Leroy Brink of first-degree murder at Basin last week is considered one of the best acts that has been done by a jury within the state in many years. 1 prisoner got a life sentence, 2 got 20 years, and 2 more got 3 years. This was an expedited process that only took a few weeks." The Riverton Republic wrote, quote, "The 10 sleep murder cases had Sabin and Alexander plead guilty to second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years each. Eaton and Dixon pled guilty to charges of manslaughter and received a sentence of 3 years each. Herbert Leroy Brink has already been convicted of first-degree murder due to the killing of Joseph Allemand in the raid of April 2nd and will be allowed a new trial where he will plead guilty to murder in the second degree and will be sentenced to life. The Wool Growers Association objected to the light sentences. Whether or not the Wool Growers Association felt that they had been fleeced by the courts, they still might have found some relief in the following years. Though additional raids on sheep camps occurred, following the convictions, no more sheepmen were murdered. Locally in Fremont County, the Wyoming Wool Growers Association hired a detective Joe LaForce to protect sheep interests there. In 1910, there were disputes on the deadline drawn near Dubois and rumors that the cattlemen were planning to drive sheep from the range and mountains. Another incident in 1918 occurred 8 miles west of Shoshone when a number of raiders went to the sheep wagon of Mr. Lichty Pratt in Burkett and began shooting at the lights in the sheep wagon. They also scattered and shot the band of sheep, smashed up their wagons, and stole their supplies. After the raiders had scattered the band, coyotes came over and destroyed another 40 to 50 sheep. However, unlike many of the disputes which occurred over crossed deadlines, this range was owned by the sheepherders, giving no real excuse to the cattlemen to justify their raid. Though you can attribute the decrease in violence between sheep and cattlemen to a number of reasons, it also helped that cattlemen and sheepmen began hedging their bets by raising both cattle and sheep simultaneously. While there were more territorial disputes, it was less between strictly cattle and strictly sheep property, and more so general territorial disputes. The creation of the Forest Service also helped reduce the number of territorial disputes. Instead of cattlemen and sheepherders being able to range wherever they pleased, they needed to pay grazing fees for territories from the U.S. government. The Riverton Review aptly sums up the decades of cattle range wars in a February 1927 article. Quote, "The cowman was the first user of the public ranges and viewed the encroaching bands of sheep negatively. In many places, the cowmen were forced off their old ranges by sheepmen, and many shooting scrapes, not without their death list, were indulged in. There was an old-time prejudice that said a range used once by sheep would never be used by cattle again because of the noise and stench of the sheep, though this is not true. But because of the old-time prejudice, the double use of the range by both cattle and sheep cannot be practiced except in a few areas, and instead, cattlemen and sheepmen are kept on separate allotments. The Forest Service established an equilibrium and served as an authority to place contending parties on separate ranges where they must confine their stock by herding in short stretches of fence. For one man to deliberately leave his own range and encroach upon that of another is considered little short of a crime, and the offender may have his range taken entirely from him. The stockman must pay the government a small grazing fee amounting to less than $1 per head of cattle and less than 25 cents per head of sheep, but they may keep their range year after year paying this fee. As a result, the range wars are no more. However, perhaps they have been too early in saying that the range wars were no more. Just several months later, 2 men in DuBois were jailed for killing sheep. Frank Van Scoik and Willis Rima were both thrown in the county jail by Sheriff Bob Gaylord and Undersheriff Spencer Gaylord, charged with killing sheep belonging to Frank Welty, which were allegedly being ranged on Rima's property. The officers made the arrests based on the claims of finding fresh sheep pelts which lined pack saddles and had the brands clipped, but sufficient marks show that they may have been the Welty brand. W.J. Irving of the State Enforcement Department was sent to DuBois in order to prevent any additional outbreaks in the potential range war. Federal officials were also sent in from Washington, D.C. to try to put any potential agitation and retaliation to bed. In December of that year, in 1927, William Rima and Frank Van Scoik of DuBois were acquitted by the jury on the charge of unlawfully killing sheep. Sheep belonging to Frank Welty had been killed on a property leased by Rima, and fresh sheep pelts had been used on the pack saddles of Rima and Van Scoik, and the cuttings of these pelts fitted the Welty sheep brand. However, while the jury deemed that the sheep had been unlawfully slain, they could not conclusively prove it had been the 2 defendants who did it. The killing of Welty's sheep in Fremont County is the last recorded case in Fremont County that may have led to another range war. Perhaps Rima and Van Scoik did not kill a sheep, and it was just a series of unfortunate events that led to their arrest. Or perhaps this was just another instance of cattlemen being given a free pass by the law, despite the evidence mounted against them. Perhaps this is just one more page of the long book where cattlemen have, often quite brutally, attempted to assert their dominance over the sheepherders of the West. That's it for this episode of the Rediscover the Winds podcast. Next episode will focus on the opening of the Wind River Reservation. Rediscover the Winds, a Wyoming history podcast, is brought to you in part by the Wind River Cultural Centers Foundation. The WRCCF is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping Fremont County museums preserve our Wyoming and Wind River cultural and natural history by directly supporting the efforts of the DuBois Museum, the Pioneer Museum in Lander, and the Riverton Museum. To learn more, visit windriverccf.com and help us conserve our past while enriching our present. Thank you.